Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our meeting, and this is the 5th meeting. We have had 4 meetings so far, and in those 4 meetings we've been discussing issues that relate to the philosophy of science in economics. And as you are aware, your program requires you to go through this course called Philosophy of Science. Now, just to remind you what we have so far covered in the last 4 meetings. In the first 2 meetings, we covered the nature of understanding. And in that lecture, or in those 2 meetings or lectures, we covered knowledge. We covered nature of reality, and I think here there are 2 major things that we did discuss, and that is reality and illusion. We also discussed how reality is experienced. Of course, we were unable to complete, so in the meeting that followed, which was the 2nd meeting, we covered the concepts, the building blocks of understanding, and we went through the nature of concepts, constructs, and variables were also discussed. So we had an opportunity in that meeting to look at what we call conceptual systems. And we discovered that conceptual systems are actually the basis for deeper understanding of what we call knowledge. So those were the first 2 meetings, but the first 2 meetings centered around knowledge and the nature of understanding. Now, if you recall, in our meeting 3 and meeting 4, that you may actually call lecture 3 and lecture 4, we took on yet another important topic, which is constructing the world. And in meeting 3 and meeting 4, we did break that aspect of constructing the world into 2 major aspects. But just to give you a recap of what we covered in general, we looked at the philosophical essay on probability by Pierre-Simon Laplace. We also had an opportunity to discuss the Laplacian demon. We continued with our discussions on the Laplace's scrutability thesis, which were probably broken into 3, if you remember: the inferential scrutability, the conditional scrutability, and the a priori scrutability. And then thereafter, we did venture into the application of Laplacian demon to epistemology, to philosophy of science, to metaphysics, and a number of other related disciplines. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you are able to pick something that is relevant for your course, since you are studying a PhD program in energy economics. Today, I want to go into another related aspect, which is actually a continuation of these very important series of lectures and meetings in the philosophy of science. Now, today I want to introduce a concept that will probably act as a bridge between philosophy and economics. And the topic that we are going to cover now, I'll call it History and Relevance of Philosophy of Science in Economics. So in other words, we have now started delving into the philosophy of economics. And we want to understand this subject very well, so that at the end of the day, when we are conceptualizing and undertaking research in this discipline, we are not at a loss. We really understand how these things relate to economics. And of course, I'll also bring out debates that have been put forward for quite some period now about philosophy and about economics, and as to whether these 2 disciplines can actually meet to form what we call philosophy of economics or philosophy of science in economics, or probably these are two separate disciplines. Now, ladies and gentlemen, since for quite some time I've been giving you reference books, I think it will work out well for me again to give you some of the reference books that you must read. And I know that you already have some of these because I did give you these books. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to go and read the book Conjectures and Refutations by Karl Popper. And if you recall, that's a book I gave you in class some time back. The book is called Conjectures and Refutations. So you'll need that book, and it's written by Karl Popper. Now, the second book that you need to read, it is called The Philosophy and the Methodology of Economics. So I want you to read The Philosophy and Methodology of Economics. And it is in volumes, volume 1 to volume 3. And of course, the authors of those books, the Caldwell, 1993, and you'll find these books very relevant. I also want to invite you to read Davis et al., 1998, and of course there are so many other people who contributed to the writing, the development of this book, and the title is The Handbook of Economic Methodology, and this is published by the Cheltenham Edward Elgar, 1998. So the other book that I want you to get is a book that is written by Davis in 2006, and it is called Recent Developments in Economic Methodology, and it is in volumes still, volume 1 up to volume 3, and that will be very good for you to read. And please, during your free time, you can also pick a book called Philosophy of Economics, and it is an anthology, and it is a Cambridge University Press book. Very, very good. You need to read it. The other book you could read is the Oxford Handbook of the Philosophy of Economics. Please do not lose sight of that. And of course, the authors are Kincaid and Ross. And then you can also read another book called The Dismal Queen of the Social Sciences, in Fact and Fiction in Economics. And it deals with realism, models, and social construction. So I want to invite you to read those books. Don't forget that famous book I gave you on the structure of scientific revolution by Kuhn. And the book is published in 1962. And then you can also read the works of Lakatos. Today I'll be talking about Lakatos, 1970. And the book is about falsification and the methodology of scientific research program. You can also read Lakatos, 1978, the methodology of scientific research program again. And you can read again Lakatos and Musgrove, 1970, Criticism and the Growth of Knowledge, and that is published by Cambridge University Press. And you can also read London 1977, Progress and Its Problems Towards a Theory of Scientific Growth, and this is published by Routledge, ladies and gentlemen. So those books that I've given you will form a basis for this lecture, and a few other lectures, probably lecture 6 and 7, and then I'll also be giving you other books. So I know that last time when we met, I did give you a book that is written by Canup, and of course, I hope and I pray that you find time to go through those books, ladies and gentlemen. Now, recall the fact that it's important for us to understand the philosophy of science if we are to meaningfully undertake research. And I've just told you that in this lecture, we'll look at the history and relevance of philosophy of science in economics. We need to trace the developments of economics in terms of philosophy, so that we understand this very well. Now, whenever science operates at the cutting edge of what is known, ladies and gentlemen, invariably that particular discipline that you probably call a science runs into what we call philosophical issues. So philosophy cannot be left behind. So people will begin asking questions. So philosophical issues about the nature of knowledge and reality will always come up. So they always ask you, what is knowledge in this? What do you constitute to be knowledge? And how do you really tell that this is knowledge? And therefore, this same concept is an important concept that cuts into this discipline that we call philosophy of science. So philosophy of science becomes an important thing that we must really go into. So the philosophical issues about the nature of knowledge and reality become very, very pertinent in this case. So you'll have controversies coming up, and these are scientific controversies. And scientific controversies raise such questions as the relation of theory and experiment. I know that in economics we have experiments, but I'm also aware that theories have been developed, and we also use theory to explain reality out there. But there is a controversy that may arise from time to time linking theory and experiment. And also controversies raise another question, and that question is the nature of explanation. So people will be worried and bothered about the explanations you are providing, and the extent to which science can approximate to the truth. Remember, in knowledge creation, the question of truth is very central. The question of truth is at the core of everything we do. And that's why knowledge is actually defined in terms of truth, and that's why we call it justified true belief. But later on in our discussions, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll bear with me, we shall have a discussion about that very definition of knowledge. And if we reach that stage and dismiss it, do not really feel very bad and say that, you know, at one stage you told us that knowledge is justified true beliefs. So, but we shall certainly interrogate that definition, and then also present facts and probably information that has been generated over time, and see how relevant that is. So science is very important. It's at the core of everything. And the nature of knowledge and reality becomes very, very critical, and that's why controversies will always come up. So within particular sciences, ladies and gentlemen, special concerns arise about what exists out there and how it can be known. And that is really knowledge, right? What exists, what knowledge exists, right? And how can it be known? And that's a central philosophical question. For example, physics is concerned about the nature of space and time. For example, psychology is concerned about the nature of consciousness. Hence, the philosophy of science in this case is an essential part of the scientific investigation of the world. So that's why you have philosophy of science in psychology, philosophy of science in physics, philosophy of science in biology, philosophy of science in economics, philosophy of science in mathematics, philosophy of science in marketing, philosophy of science in procurement, philosophy of science in logistics, and of course supply chains and so forth. So the central question and questions of reality will always come up. So the nature of knowledge that exists out there and how it can be known becomes a central question. And this is a question that we are trying to grapple with in the area of economics, and that's why we are dealing with the philosophy of economics, ladies and gentlemen. So it's very, very important, because the philosophy of science is an essential part of the scientific investigation of the world. And we want to understand the world around us. And that's why one of the early philosophers said that the unexamined life is not worth living. So in recent decades, ladies and gentlemen, the philosophy of science has become an increasingly central part of philosophy in general. And although there are still philosophers who think that theories of knowledge and reality can be developed by pure reflection, much current philosophical work finds it necessary and valuable to take into account relevant scientific findings. And that's why we must understand what exists. So I think at some stage, if you recall, when I did talk about, for instance, the positivistic kind of thinking, and people who ascribe to this kind of thinking, they believe that knowledge exists out there, and you can actually pick this knowledge objectively using all the scientific tools and principles at our disposal. But of course, the naturalists have a different perspective altogether, and they believe that knowledge is subjective. But without going into that kind of debate, I'm just demonstrating to you how important it is for us to think that theories and reality can be developed by using a number of perspectives. One, there's a group that thinks that you can use pure reflection. And of course, there are others who believe that much and current philosophical work will find it very, very valuable to take into consideration and into account relevant scientific findings. So you begin with the knowledge that exists out there. And if you recall, in some of our face-to-face we had and meetings, I did tell you that if you want to understand a discipline very well and contribute knowledge in that discipline, then you must stand on the tallest tree in that forest. And I told you that in this case, forest refers to literature that's available in every discipline. In economics, you've got a forest of literature, a forest of knowledge, a forest of publications. And if you want to understand what exists and be on top of things, then you must stand on the tallest shoulder of a scholar who probably has taken into consideration all the various research works and findings in that particular area. And of course, these are fellows who are promoting the disciplines in that area. And in every discipline, you will find specific individuals who have devoted their time trying to discuss, understand, and develop that discipline, ladies and gentlemen. So you must take into account relevant scientific findings. I can also give you an example in the philosophy of mind. If you're dealing with the philosophy of mind, now that philosophy of mind is closely tied to empirical psychology, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, political theory often intersects with economics. You know that very well. That's why we talk about political economy. But you must understand the various theoretical frameworks and bases and philosophical foundations that bring these two disciplines together so that you can actually provide an adequate explanation of reality out there, ladies and gentlemen. So, therefore, philosophy of science provides a valuable bridge between philosophical and scientific inquiry. So you will not undertake research on this degree program that you are pursuing, which is a PhD in energy economics, without really taking into consideration these philosophical aspects. So your study must be grounded, right? It must be underpinned by philosophical aspects and philosophical thoughts. And these are very relevant issues that you must think about, ladies and gentlemen. So now we can't say, and of course you need to know this, because if you don't appreciate the discipline that you are studying and where you are going to undertake some bit of scientific inquiries, then you are not moving anywhere. So in the course of history, ladies and gentlemen, economics has been variously defined, including, I'm going to give you some of those things that economists have included in the definition of economics. So over time and in historical times, economics has been variously defined, including as the study of the consequences of actors, right? So those are some of the things that you find: the study of the consequences of the actors' selfish pursuit of maximum wealth. So there are some scholars who have come up with that definition, and of course more abstractly in terms of economizing or getting the most for the least, while others have defined economics in terms of exchange in the market, and others have used words like the measuring rod of money as a concept or concepts being used in the definition of economics, while others have looked at economics in terms of rational choice faced with a scarcity of means in relation to a multiplicity of ends. So that's why you have those issues of scarcity, issues of choice, and they always talk about the central problem in economics, which leads to certain scarcity. We always have scarce resources. Now, those are some of the things that they advance in the definitions that you will find in literature about economics, ladies and gentlemen. But let me just put in a caveat at this moment and say that even if economics is conceived as a science of choice, only a small proportion of economic explanation is designed to explain episodes of individual behavior. So the issue of individual behavior has been left out and largely ignored by economists. That does not mean that there are no economists who have attempted to do that. They are there. And that's why today we are discussing the philosophy of science in economics, right? Because if you are looking at economics as a science of choice, then we must go full blast into economic explanations, which are designed to explain episodes of individual behavior. Right, now, of course, previously, and most of the works you'll find in economics, those works have sought to account for what we call aggregate or social level phenomenon, and they have attempted to look at patterns or regularities that have been observed statistically or through ordinary experiences. So we are saying that most of it, right, and here we are talking about those aspects that constitute the definitions, right, those things that constitute the perspectives and the views of economics as a science of choice. So most of it seeks to explain aggregate or social level phenomenon. And that's why we'll talk about aggregate demand. We'll be talking about a number of other things which are there. But the economists have tended to utilize, of course, statistical perspectives or numbers to explain ordinary experiences that we go through. So that's why numbers there. And you'll find that econometrics is at the center of everything. And of course, when you talk about econometrics, for those who are not very familiar, and I'm not talking to economists here on this perspective, because economists do understand what econometrics is all about. But for the other people who are from other disciplines, who may not really appreciate very much what economists do in this case, you see, when we talk about econometrics, right? Just as you hear of the word psychometrics, right? Now, of course, the word metrics in those two words, psychometrics, right, or what we call econometrics, right. The word metrics in those two words simply refers to measurements, right? Measurement. So when you say psychometrics, then you bring the issue of psychology and other related disciplines. When you say econometrics, and these are measurements in economics, so at the end of the day, these fellows have tools, right? The psychometricians have tools that they use to measure those psychologically related constructs, whereas economics or economists will have those tools that relate to their disciplines, and you can call them actually econometrics. So it's measurements. So you will find that much of the or most of the work that has been done by economists will tend to take on numbers. They go through the modeling process, and then they'll start, and they'll tend to speak in terms of numbers. So they will say, for instance, according to the Gini coefficient, this is the interpretation of this kind of thing. According to this is what it is. Whereas now for the psychometricians, they will, of course, they will not be talking about the Gini coefficient, but they will be talking about, well, a moderate kind of relationship and prediction, and they will be talking about behavior, really, at the end of the day, measurements of behaviors. So I think here you can see that the highly idealized and formalized models in economics, which are built for this purpose, depict various kinds of what we call socio-typically market-like invisible hand mechanism. And those invisible hand mechanism will mediate between individual choices and the collective outcomes as their unintended consequences. So in economics, we tend to deal with those things, and those outcomes are represented as, for instance, equilibrium positions. You know that very well. If you go back to those, if you go back to basic economics, right? If you're talking about the law of demand, the law of supply, right, and then at the end of the day you begin talking about the intersection of supply and demand, you can talk about the equilibrium point, really, that where supply equates demand, that's what happens, the equilibrium point. So therefore you can even compute mathematically the equilibrium quantity that must be produced. And you can also talk about the supply, right? So the equilibrium in terms of supply and the equilibrium in terms of demand and so forth. So equilibrium price can be also arrived at. Equilibrium quantity can be arrived at by simply taking the equation for the demand. It's a demand equation. And of course, these are simple economic models, and you get also the equation for supply. And when you solve those two equations simultaneously, you get a point at which these two actually meet, and you can always pick that point, ladies and gentlemen. So the outcomes in economics are represented in terms of equilibrium positions. And you can, by the way, this is just, I've just given an example. You can extend the idea even to labor. Supply of labor and demand for labor. So here the prediction in economics that is developed at the end of the day often does not describe the process whereby the equilibria are attained. So we don't go into the process. We simply come up with equations, we come up with models, and we say, I've got the equilibrium price, I've got the equilibrium quantity, but you do not really take us through the entire process. And even then, at the time when you are coming up with the demand curve and the and the supply curve, I mean, there are so many assumptions that you are going to make in economics. You are going to assume other factors constant, and that's the ceteris paribus assumption, right? You assume other things are constant, but let me tell you, in reality, those things are never constant. So you can't assume that those things are constant. But anyhow, whatever the case, you can build a sophisticated model where all those things are not held constant, and then you try to examine and see what is happening, ladies and gentlemen. So adding a normative dimension to the explanatory use of social mechanism, then the outcomes that I've been talking about can be portrayed either as generous, and we have examples in the Mandevillean idea of the private vices and public virtues. I'm sure you are very familiar with this since you're economists. And in contemporary welfare theorems, these are aspects that come up here. And of course, you also have these ones that I've just mentioned, which come up as undesirable products of the invisible backhand mechanisms of prisoner's dilemma type and so forth. So that's why you have the prisoner's dilemma, you have the private vices, you have the public virtues, and so forth. So economics has characteristics that make it a fertile ground for philosophical argument and analysis. And that's why we are actually covering this course that we call philosophy of science in economics. So when we look at economics and we examine the aspects that are being discussed and the research that is going on and the behaviors of individuals or consumers, certainly it becomes apparent and we get convinced that economics as a discipline has characteristics that make it a fertile ground for the philosophical arguments and analysis. And that's why we bring in philosophy of science. So economics, ladies and gentlemen, is, and throughout its history, has been a chronically contested discipline. You know that very well. Throughout history, economics has been a contested discipline, right? Now, I'll give you these contestations, ladies and gentlemen. For example, to some people, economics is the queen of the social sciences, right? And for those who believe that economics is the queen of the social sciences, they believe that economics is characterized by uncompromised formal rigor. So in other words, there is a rigor that goes into research, rigor that goes into the modeling. They test their models for a number of things, right? And at the end of it, they say, our model is robust enough to explain these things, right? And of course, those who continue to promote the same argument that economics is the queen of the social sciences, they also believe that this economics has what we call indispensable cognitive authority in social engineering. And of course, they also believe that economics is perhaps the only social science worth the name science. So they will say economics is a science, right, in the social sciences worth the name science. And they will dismiss other sciences. And that's one perspective, and it's a view, ladies and gentlemen. We all have differing views about reality out there. Now, that is one group of individuals or scholars who believe that economics is the queen of the social sciences. Now, I'll tell you that there's another category of individuals who believe that, that this subject, this discipline called economics, is the dismal science in the special sense of being an empirical failure. Right, that's what I said. It's the dismal science in the special sense of being an empirical failure and capable and has been promoting dubious cultural values and group interests in society. And of course, those fellows also think that it's a discipline that is only pretentious, pretentiously scientific. I think you can see on the other side, we have a group of individuals, right, as I told you a few minutes ago, who believe that economics is the queen of the social sciences. And then they try to promote that kind of thought, right? They say there is uncompromised formal rigor in research, right? Indispensable cognitive authority in social engineering, right? And they go ahead and they say it's the only subject worth, in the social sciences, the only subject worth the name science. Now, on the other side of the fence, you have another group who are saying, no, economics is a failure, right? Economics has failed in many respects, right? It's an empirical failure, right? Economics has promoted dubious cultural values and, of course, a group interest in society. And they believe that economics is only pretentiously scientific. So there's a lot of pretense that economics is scientific when the actual sense it is not. That is a feeling of a certain group of individuals, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why I told you this is a debate. And I want you to join me to actually read as much as you can. I've given you a number of reference books. Maybe one of these days we shall have another forum where we are going to discuss these things. So, ladies and gentlemen, there are many things that contribute to the controversial nature of economics. And as you can see, this is very, very, very important. For instance, economics is an academic discipline with broad public dimensions. And that's another perspective, you see. Economics is a discipline, quite important, right, and very useful, but with broad public dimensions, and that's another perspective. And its concerns are connected to the most basic aspects of people's daily lives, and that's why reality becomes very important here, and therefore the ideological and political stakes are obvious. And that's why when you begin talking about economics, you'll always find ideological stakes in it. And at another level, you'll find political stakes and economic stakes in this subject, ladies and gentlemen. So, as an epistemic institution, I hope now you know the word epistemology, and I don't want to really derail you and spend much time talking about this. In knowledge, we deal with the concepts like ontology. I did tell you that at the beginning. Ontology, right? We deal with epistemology. We deal with axiology, we deal with the metaphysics, we deal with methodology, we deal with methods. And some of the classes we have had, face-to-face classes, I've shown you how these things interact to inform our investigations. So now when we look at this area or this discipline of knowledge called economics, because there is a certain body of knowledge or bodies that have emerged over time, ladies and gentlemen, we can see that as an epistemic institution, economics enjoys a strong position in contemporary society. And there's no question about that. And with an institutionalized authority and questioned by many people. And that's why we must be able to promote this discipline. So whereas that situation and that position exists, ladies and gentlemen, economics deals with a subject matter that is very complex. If you recall, in the first two lectures, where I talked about reality and the nature of reality, I did tell you that reality is very complex. I also told you that reality can be an illusion, right? And I gave an example of a mirage, if you recall that very well. All right? And you can also use another example. You put probably two sticks on top of, let's say, a basin that is containing water, and look through the water and see the shape of those two sticks that would have put on top of the basin, and see how those two sticks suddenly appear. Now, of course, some people will interpret those sticks that way. They will think that maybe the sticks are really bent, when in the actual sense they are not bent, because that's what you see even in a mirage. On a sunny day, you may think that you actually have a pool of water, And if you're very thirsty, you may actually run very fast. And if you are one of those fellows who enjoy swimming, you can easily dive onto it, only to realize that you are diving onto a very hard surface. So it is quite important for us to understand the issue of illusion and the issue of reality, and therefore these are the things that happen in economics. Economics is very complex as a subject, and economics is an important subject, very hard to get under epistemic control. So the chances of error are considerable, ladies and gentlemen. So economics must be seen as that, and therefore the application of philosophy of science becomes very central at this material time. So at the same time, ladies and gentlemen, the subject matter in economics is close to common sense experience and beliefs. Because when you start talking about the law of demand, for instance, right, and then you start talking about those particular factors that determine demand, and you start talking about incomes, start talking about seasonal factors, you start talking about preferences, habits and preferences, and so forth. I mean, all those things, they seem to be common sense experiences and beliefs, right? And yet they are very important for us to delve into the philosophy of science in economics. So here I think we'll note two things, ladies and gentlemen, as we come to the close of this session. We'll have another session to continue with the discussion of of these very important things that we are talking about. But certainly, at this level, we can say that economic theory violates those things that we've been talking about: common sense experience and beliefs. So economics may actually violate them in two recognizable ways, and through its theoretical idealizations, right? And that's why we must delve into the theoretical idealizations of economics and bring in the concepts of philosophy of science. And then two, through the corrections it suggests to make of common sense beliefs by replacing them with the allegedly deeper but counterintuitive theories. So those are really very important issues in the area of economics. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, an important source of controversy in economics is a chronic mismatch between expectations and actual performance in relation to whatever goals economics is supposed to pursue, ladies and gentlemen. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for having attended this meeting and for participating in this discussion where I have just given you the history, because we need to understand this history very well, right? That's the history and relevance of philosophy of science in economics. Unfortunately, we are just debating those issues, so possibly we haven't gone deep into the discussions. But you know very well where we've come from in terms of economics, in terms of philosophy of economics, and the relevance of philosophy of science in economics. Do not forget to read those books that I gave you: Conjunctures and Refutations by Karl Popper, The Philosophy and the Methodology of Economics, right from Volume 1 to Volume 3, the Handbook of Economic Methodology, ladies and gentlemen, Recent Developments in Economic Methodology, Philosophy of Economics, an Anthology, and that's a Cambridge book, and the Oxford Handbook of Philosophy of Economics, again Oxford, and of course Kuhn, 1962, The Structure of Scientific Revolution. And as you prepare for our next meeting, please read Lactos, 1978, The Methodology of Scientific Research Programs, and Lactos and Musgrove, 1970, Criticism and the Growth of Knowledge, and Laubdan, Progress and its Problems towards the Theory of Scientific Growth. And those books will prove very, very relevant for our next meeting. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I wish you a nice time. Enjoy your day. Bye.